Okay, everyone, welcome to our webinar on immigration, residency, and double tax. My name is Kate Trollope. I'm part of the Robert Cowan Investments team. We are a subsidiary of Anchor Capital. We hope you find today very interesting and thought-provoking. We just wanted to let you know that there will not be a Q&A session after the presentation today. This topic is very case specific. So if you have any questions or comments, or you'd like to discuss anything with us, our email addresses are available at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to pop us an email. Our presenters today are Di Hayden and Michael McKinnon. Di Hayden is the CEO of Robert Cowan Investments and has been working at RCI for 32 years. She's just completed her certificate in Principles of International Tax and came in as top 3 of her class. She has a wealth of knowledge and experience and is very well worth listening to. Michael McKinnon is an experienced international tax accountant, specializing in international tax and cross-border tax and corporate structuring. Having studied South African and international tax at the University of Johannesburg, he is also fortunate enough to be schooled under the guidance of some of the top tax minds in South Africa. He's very involved in the immigration work that we do and assists us with many of our clients' matters. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to Di Hayden. Please enjoy.
Morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Kate for our introduction. And I think this is obviously a very topical topic. There are lots of you on this webinar today, and you all have different circumstances. We'll find that some of them you have left without ever earning any money here. You've probably got a tax number. There's some of you who've retired elsewhere. There are all sorts of circumstances. So because of that, we are going to keep this very high level. And we will obviously follow up later on. If you do want to chat to us, you can email us, as Kate said. So here we go. Immigration, residency, and double tax. So what are we actually going to talk about today in doing this presentation, this webinar to you? Our topics today are, and first of all, it's very important to define what immigration is. Immigration is leaving one's place of residence or country to live elsewhere. Immigration is something else. We are concentrating on immigration and on leaving South Africa. We're going to look at what your choices are. We're going to look at tax residency, which has a huge part to play in this topic. We are going to talk about double tax agreements, which most people don't even know are a thing, or they need to look at them. We're going to look at the process, and that's where Michael will be very valuable. He's done lots of immigrations. He understands it very well. And we're going to point out the pitfalls along the way. And after that, you can then make your choices as to, is immigrating what you really want to do, or is it not? So let's go ahead and look at what your choices are. What you have to consider when emigrating. First thing is, are you going or are you staying? And that sounds quite obvious, but sometimes there are muddied waters because you're not quite sure what to do. But if you need to make a decision. You can't sort of hover on the fence and be a bit in and a bit out. So are you going or are you staying? That's your decision. And why are you emigrating? Are you emigrating because you're going to work somewhere else? Are you already abroad and working and have not emigrated? Are you going to retire somewhere else? Are you going to leave South Africa behind you because of all the issues that we seem to have here? Are you going for tax reasons? And there are many, many more. But it's important to understand why you think emigration is an option to determine whether you do or do not choose to emigrate. Just looking at my notes, so go with me here. As I've said, it's very case specific. So that's why we're not taking questions, because your circumstances are not the same as everybody else's. And it does depend very often. We need to talk to you about that, assuming you want some help. Where are you going to be resident? You need to understand the rules in the country you are going to. What sort of visa will you have? Are you already a citizen somewhere else? Do you want to keep dual citizenship? Do you have a foreign passport? All that goes into determining your residency or where you are not resident. If you do decide to go and you do decide to emigrate, what tax are you going to have to pay from South Africa, from a South African perspective? What tax is there going to be in the new country of residence? Is there a double tax agreement with the place where you're going? Does it matter if there is or if there isn't? And we're going to go into that in a bit more detail later on. And lastly, how do you do this if you are going to emigrate? And that is why we have Michael with us to tell you how the process works. So moving on, I keep on referring to residency and I keep on referring to tax. What one needs to understand is what is your tax residency status. And because we're leaving South Africa, and that's the focus of this presentation, we're not leaving somewhere else, one needs to understand the SA tax regime. As an SA tax resident, you are subject to tax on your worldwide assets. So if you leave South Africa and go anywhere else, tax is due on everything that you have globally as well. Just because you have sent money offshore by ex-con allowance does not mean that it is outside the SA tax net. How do you determine then if you are or are not SA tax resident? And there are two tests for natural persons. We are not concentrating on what they term non-natural persons, e.g. companies. And there are two tests of residency. The one being, are you ordinarily resident? And the other one being, are you physically present in South Africa and are therefore subject to tax as an SA resident? Next slide, to elaborate on the last slide. To work out whether you are resident here, are you ordinarily resident? Or do you comply with physical presence test? So ordinarily resident is slightly difficult from the point of view that there are no statutory rules. You can't look at a list and say, well, I am ordinarily resident or I'm not. There are no rules. But there is case law and there are legal precedents that have been set that determine how the courts, how SARS, and just bear in mind, SARS is an interpretation note on this, whether you are or aren't resident, according to them, to just establish your tax residency in South Africa. And what do they take into account? So if you are ordinarily resident, they look at things like, where do you live? Do you have a permanent home here? They're not interested on the number of days you're in the country for an ordinarily residence test. They're looking at your state of mind. They're looking at continuity. Where do you come back to after you've been wandering around the globe? Do you come back to South Africa? Do you have a family here? Where are your personal interests? Do you have a gym membership? Do you belong to a golf club? Do you play tennis, etc., etc.? They look at your whole lifestyle to determine that. And do you have a place of abode? So you might not have a permanent home, but you keep all your personal belongings here. So if you think you aren't ordinarily resident, one just needs to look at the factors that are going to be taken into account to establish whether you are or aren't. Then in terms of the physical presence test, that's a little easier because it is written down and there are rules. And this applies to every single year of tax assessment. So you've got to keep on reassessing. This particularly applies to people who may come here. They've retired and they want to stay here for a while, so they emigrated, but they want to come back. Or you're working somewhere else and you want to come back. Please bear in mind that this applies. So now you're not ordinarily resident. You can be physically present. If you spend more than 91 days, and you can come and go during a year, during the year of tax assessment, and more than 91 days in each of the preceding 5 years and more than 915 days during those 5 preceding years of assessment. You have to comply with all 3 of those requirements to be physically present. It's also important to understand how residents are taxed and how non-residents are taxed. As particularly in SA, if you go, you can still be subject to tax here if you have fixed property, etc. But there again, specific circumstances we can discuss. Then, if you do not emigrate now, but you go, and you go and work or you retire, whatever, you could be considered SA resident temporarily abroad. And I'm going to hand over to Michael now to tell us what that actually means. Michael?
Hi, Di. Can you hear me?
Yeah, speak up a bit.
Hi, Di. Morning, everybody. So there's just a couple of points that I want to make on the residency that Di's just explained. First of all, the ordinary residence applies to everybody that is in South Africa. If you live, pretty much, if you put your head down on a pillow in South Africa, chances are you are ordinarily resident. So the ordinary residence test and the physical presence test have been debated over many years, and ordinary residence is actually the subject of 2 court cases. One is in 1946 and one is in 1992. So this is long established case law. And in the first case in 1946, it was decided by the judge that residency is a matter of fact or a matter of degree. A matter of fact and a matter of degree. So I often get the question as to, should we immigrate or shouldn't we? And that answer is often, or most of the time, it actually lies in the actions of the people that are asking the question. And a lot of the case, they're saying, well, should we change our tax residence or not? And in fact, by their actions, they've already done it. And often, most of the time, they've done it way back in the past without knowing it. So ordinary residence in a nutshell is the place where your ties are. They're the place where your center of financial interest is. And it is the place where you're going to wander back to after your natural wanderings, as the court put it. Or as I often say, it's where you'll die under your apple tree one day. Okay, so, and there's a lot of indicators that point to what you're actually doing, no matter what you say you're doing. And SARS is looking now. So the ordinary residence test is very applicable, and it could be, you might have an Emirates airline pilot is a good example. The Emirates airline pilot might have spent his whole career working in Dubai for Emirates. He left here when he was 18 and never formalized anything, never immigrated. And you can't, if you lose your job in Dubai, you need to come back. So there's no subsequent plan to what he's going to do after he leaves Dubai. When he finally retires and comes back to South Africa, SARS is going to say to him that you're an expat. The physical presence test, all that stuff doesn't apply to him because he's never been non-resident. From the time he left, he's always had the intention or the only possibility of coming back to South Africa. So ordinary residence is something that needs to be looked at very, very carefully. Once a person has left South Africa and become non-resident, and that can happen at any time during the year, the very next day, the physical presence test applies to you. So the physical presence test can't apply to you, first of all, in any year of assessment in which the ordinary residence test did apply. And it also cannot apply to a person who hasn't become non-resident yet. So that sounds a little bit ominous because you think, well, I've just said you can leave on one day and become subject to the PPT the next day. The sting in the tail there is that if you leave on the 30th of June, your year of assessment actually ends on the 30th of June. Very technically, because of another court case, it actually ends midnight the day before you get on the plane and leave. But let's say it ends on the 30th of June, a brand new year of assessment begins the next day. Okay, so there's a little bit of a technicality, and that explanation is relevant to when you pay the tax or when the tax that is due on exit, and we'll deal with that just now because that's not an exit tax, that's a different tax. That tax is technically due by way of provisional tax payment the day before you leave, or at the end of your year of assessment. Now, that's not quite the way that it happens in practice, but we need to discuss that in a bit more detail just now. So I often, and we'll come back to it again just now as well, but I often get the question as to can I just leave and say nothing? And the answer to that question is no. We deal with quite a lot of regularizations of people who have left in that position. Temporary residents, to get back to what I wanted me to discuss on the slide. If you leave South Africa when you're 2 years old, you'll have a South African ID number, and from an exchange control perspective, because there's always SARS and the Reserve Bank in this country to think about, you're probably going to be, with some explanation, you will be non-tax resident. So a lot of the time, people are when the facts are put on the table, they are actually non-resident. Temporarily resident abroad is an exchange control term. So for taking money out of South Africa or for investing back into South Africa, if you are temporarily abroad, and you'll be temporarily abroad until you formalize your exit in some way. It used to be with the Reserve Bank and a little bit with SARS. It's now completely with SARS. If you don't formalize that, you're going to be a South African resident temporarily abroad, even if you've been overseas for 40 years. And that's going to get you into the exchange control restrictions. If you want to be outside of the exchange control net or have less of the net apply to you, then you need to formalize your exit from South Africa and tell SARS exactly what you do. Then you'll have less of a problem with the Reserve Bank. We have a lot of trouble in this area with people that have never formalized the exit. They made a lot of money offshore, and they invest back into South Africa in direct or indirect means, and they create loop structures. Loop structures are highly legal without permission. And there's a lot of people that have existing loop structures from before the law changed a while ago, and those are very, very costly and difficult to fix. So that's what that means. Done?
Okay, done, Michael.
Yep. Finished.
So I think Michael's introduced a very important point there, and we must remember we keep on talking about tax, and that's the South African Receiver of Revenue. But there's also the South African Reserve Bank, and those are the exchange rules that apply. And very often one has to deal with both. And we'll give you a few examples of that later on. We're now going to move on. So that's just to give you some idea of how residency works. And now we're going to move on to double tax agreements. So why these are important is because one of them could apply to you if you've moved to a country and you have no idea what the new rules are going to be wherever you are. I think what's very important to point out is that in South Africa, the term resident, as it's defined, excludes any person deemed to be exclusively a resident of another country for the purposes of a double tax agreement. I'm going to say that again. Resident excludes any person deemed to be exclusively a resident of another country for the purposes of a double tax agreement. So if you're subject to a double tax agreement, that takes precedent, and how resident is defined in that is going to define where you are tax resident. So I think it's important to understand where you're going, because you need to work out whether you might actually be subject to double tax. And the reason you might be subject to double tax is if there is no double tax agreement with the country between South Africa and where you are going. One of the purposes of these double tax agreements is to make sure you are not double taxed. So that's quite an important thing to be aware of. Just to give you a bit of background onto how these double tax agreements work. And there are different types, there are multiple tax agreements and where all sorts of countries are involved. We're just talking very simply about tax agreements between South Africa and any country you choose to go to. What is double tax agreement? We've defined it there. An international agreement concluded between states in written form and governed by international law. There are basically two treaty conventions, apart from the US, which has its own particular tax model convention for the purposes of tax treaties. There are two conventions that are followed in international law. It's the OECD model and the UN model. SA primarily follows the OECD model. So all these double tax agreements more or less look the same, but there are tweaks here and there that are slightly different. It does not have tax treaties with all countries. The ones there are on the SARS website. You can go and look them up so you can see what might apply if you're going to another jurisdiction. If a double tax agreement applies, I'm going to call it a DTA now, which is the abbreviation, the treaty determines where you are tax resident. And if it looks like you have dual residency, and that you look at bullet point number 4, and you may have heard this being bandied about, the jargon, then the tiebreaker clause will apply to determine which state you are tax resident in. And what does a tiebreaker look at? And you will pick up from our definition of ordinarily resident, some of the terms are fairly similar. So the tiebreaker clause looks, because it's now determining where you're going to be tax resident, where is your permanent home? And some people have homes in both states that are part of this agreement. So if you have a home in each state, where are your close personal and economic relations held? Where does your family live, etc.? If you have no permanent home, where is your habitual abode? And there again, one's looking at where you return to after your wanderings, etc. If there is no habitual abode, in other words, in this agreement, they can't decide where your abode is, then they look at nationality. If you're a national of both states, then there has to be mutual agreement as to where you will be taxed. And if they cannot agree, then there is no tax relief or exemption. So it's quite important for you to establish a principle as to where you do want to be resident after you've emigrated, or where you want to be resident if you've decided you want one foot here and 1 foot there. But basically, you would need to understand what applies in terms of the double tax agreement. So wherever you go to be resident, please just make sure that you do understand whether a double tax agreement applies and what the consequences of that are. And again, we can help you with that and explain to you what is involved. So now moving on to perhaps the most important part of, Michael, do you want to say something?
Can I just, sorry to interrupt you, can I just add something there? I think it's important to mention that the double tax agreement can only apply you first to obtain benefit from the DTA, you have to get the DTA to apply. DTAs only apply between a resident of one state and a resident of another state. So if you haven't fixed your story up and you betwixt in between, you're not going to have access to the DTA because you're still a resident of South Africa. You can't claim benefits if you're on the same side of the contract. So it's important to get your stuff sorted out correctly and documented correctly, especially now. In the past, you were able to do things, and there's a lot of people overseas that have been there for 30, 40 years and have managed to get by. Things are closing down now. You can see with the new travel diary or travel pass that's coming at the airport, and I can talk about that and explain why I think, well, we know why that's coming. But that's an indication of how they're starting. The world's closing down. They're starting to track and trace and document everything. So you need to, and it's just becoming more and more difficult. Edward Kiswitz has said a little while ago, he's going to make non-compliance expensive and difficult, and he's done exactly that. It's becoming almost impossible and very, very difficult and frustrating to get things fixed afterwards. You can fix most things. Some of it comes at a cost, but it's difficult and frustrating to fix these things because they're not done correctly. The chances, the tiebreaker test then on a second point is there, and it's a good test. It kind of gets down to the habitual abode. It kind of gets down to the a physical presence test. It's in the end, it's going to count days. I haven't had a case yet where I've had to use the tiebreaker clause, because it's usually, we usually get to work out what the person's actual residency is, despite what they say, by their actions. So the tiebreaker clause is there, but what's important to remember is that you cannot live in this world where you're not resident anywhere. In the Cohen case in 1946, the judge said every man needs to have a residence on land somewhere. So the chances of you having being a citizen of the world on a ship somewhere, those days are long, long gone. Okay, so you're going to be resident here or there, and your actions will decide where that is. Okay.
Thank you. And I think that also raises another point. I mentioned these model tax conventions. One of them is established by the OECD, and to a large extent, they're the ones that are driving the CRS legislation, where we all have to comply with common reporting standards, where tax jurisdictions can now share all information. So you can't say something in one jurisdiction and then do something else in another. You can't gift something in one jurisdiction and in the other jurisdiction assume you can just make it alone. They will find out, because all these tax authorities can now share the information, and it's very important to have all your ducks in a row and all your documentation done correctly. Moving on now to Michael's great moment, where he is now going to tell us what the process is with respect to how you emigrate. I think before he starts, all I would like to say is please be prepared. Please understand you're leaving one place, you're going to another. And if you really are leaving the one place, i.e. South Africa, get your ducks in a row before you go. It's a lot easier than doing it 30 to 40 years later, where you might find you've fallen foul of some SARS or Reserve Bank regulation and then are subject to a fine. So let's move on, Michael, and it's you. What happens when you emigrate?
Okay, so just to put this topic into context, it has become easier than it was in the past. So to put that into perspective, the focus changed on the 28th of February 2001. So the Reserve Bank couched this as a modernization of the Reserve Bank and bringing itself into the modern world. And they've now made the focus of leaving South Africa a tax process rather than an exchange control process. So what I've learned over the years is that the exchange controls in South Africa are there, and they in my view, are as stringent as they always were. If you break an exchange control law, the penalties are stiff and they come thick and fast. The Reserve Bank, as you can see in the Jooste matter, the Reserve Bank has these very wide and far-reaching powers that no one else has. I've seen matters frozen in the Reserve Bank for 3 years without a word from the Reserve Bank, and at the end of the 3 years, they just extended for another 3 years. And in the meantime, everything was frozen. So you don't want to mess with the Reserve Bank. It's still very, very active and it works well. So the Reserve Bank is still involved in this process, but it works in the background. So under the old process, let's call that the old process with an MP 336. So that was a Reserve Bank form. You would have to fill in quite a long list of documentation and authorized dealer documentation. So that would be Standard Bank or Nedbank or whichever bank you bank at. The Reserve Bank doesn't talk to people in the street, so you'd have to work through an authorized dealer. But there was a lot of documents to fill in, and it was quite a long, complex process, and you had to apply to the Reserve Bank to get approval to emigrate. That process has now come to an end. One of the things you needed in that process was a tax clearance. So that process is now ended. From the 1st of March 2021, last year onwards, it's now become a tax process. So there was a sticking point in the process because SARS is still working, and I believe there's more changes coming now in December to make the system a little bit more streamlined. The actual change in tax residence on the SARS system wasn't available to us as practitioners. So what we did for the first year while this process was developing is we got tax clearances for everybody, immigration tax clearances, so that the money could move. And we marked where we were able to with SARS that you had changed your tax residence. That process has now become a little bit more streamlined than it was, and there's now a definite change in tax residence. We can go into your tax profile and change your tax residence to non-resident from a particular date. And from that date, or technically the midnight the night before, that your residence will change. SARS backdates them to the date that you choose, the actual date that you left upon production of necessary documentary proof. It takes about four weeks, more or less. It's 21 working days, but that is always extended past. So it takes about a month to 5 weeks to get this process finished. If there's no queries from SARS, you don't need a tax clearance. Your tax affairs do need to be compliant. SARS won't entertain any change in tax residence or immigration if you owe them money or you've got lots of tax returns outstanding. It's a stick that they use. So they will want your tax to be compliant. I have had some cases where they dig into companies and trusts behind the taxpayer and say that they're not compliant, so fix them up as well. I've had a couple of those. If you want money to move, you need a tax clearance. Money under the new system now, whether you're immigrating or not, money doesn't leave this country without a tax clearance of some sort. So at the moment, there's an immigration tax clearance, there's an investment tax clearance, and there's a discretionary allowance that requires that you now have a good standing tax clearance, just a general tax clearance. The investment clearance and the immigration clearance are no different, and they're going to drop the immigration clearance in December. So you'll just have an FIA, or foreign investment allowance clearance, that will be used going forward, and that's going to apply to residents and non-residents. So the $1 million and $10 million allowances that you've all been using over the years are exchange control allowances that are applicable to residents, but non-residents are still being subjected to those limits just for tax clearance purposes. So in theory, you can take 100 million rand out of South Africa if you have it available in one calendar year. But that is an amount above 10 million, and it's a special tax clearance. That's special tax clearance and a special application to the Reserve Bank to let the money go out. They'll let the money go out, but you must understand that you're going to jump through significantly higher hoops as to explaining where the money came from. If you've done anything wrong in the past, that's where it's going to come out. Okay, so that's, in a nutshell, that's the process that we follow. More detail than that is we actually change your residence on the system, and within a day or so, we get given a letter with a list of requirements that SARS wants. It starts with a motivation letter, and then we start listing all the supporting documents. The most important being the rights or proof of the right that you have to live in the other country. You can't claim residence in another country if you don't have the right to live there. So, for example, Dubai. It's not. We immigrate people to Dubai all the time, those that want to go, obviously, but you need to have a plan. You need to be able to show SARS that you're there temporarily and you have a plan that doesn't force you to come back to South Africa to leave your job. So in most cases, we jump that hurdle and we're able to get past that point. So it's the most important is the visa or the path that you have to getting permanent residency to stay in that country. And then there's other supporting documents like IDs, passports, proof of residence, the capital gains tax calculations. They want proof that you have no ties left back in South Africa. So you're allowed to have bank accounts and investments. But if you've got minor kids or kids at school or a home or kids in a home that's available to you, you're going to start having difficulties explaining to them that you don't have a home left to you in South Africa. You can have a vacant home that you use for holidays once a year, but you, and this is where it starts getting subjective, and you may be subject to arguments. So at the moment, SARS is approving everyone's immigration, but you'll see on the letter when it comes that they reserve the right to audit you later, and we know that they're coming. They started to focus now on the expats, and if you're not non-resident and you're overseas, you must be an expat. You're one of the two. So SARS is going to start looking into that. And you can see on the new tax returns already, they're now starting to ask quite a lot of detail about the number of days that you're out of South Africa. It's a new thing on the tax returns. And the travel pass is coming. And the travel pass, the most important thing about the travel pass is they're tracking days. I know of people that are in South Africa that are not residents in South Africa, that don't pay tax here, but every time you talk to them, they're in South Africa. Those people are going to get caught now. Why SARS is bringing out a travel pass specifically, I'm not sure, because they can track this kind of detail quite easily through passport control at OR and we know they keep very good records there. So the last and most important thing to talk about is the capital gains tax. So on your way out of South Africa, you're subject to capital gains tax, and it's not an exit tax. You don't pay tax to leave South Africa. What it is it's your last share of capital gains tax that is due on any capital gain that you might have made up to the date that you're resident in South Africa. No tax is fair. We can have lots of discussions and arguments about that. This, in the scheme of the tax world, it is correct. It's a correct tax that you need to pay on the way out. SARS won't have another opportunity to tax you on your worldwide capital gains and assets after you've left, because after you become non-resident, they have no jurisdiction on anything outside of South Africa. You will pay tax on income sourced in South Africa and income deemed to be sourced in South Africa. Anything earned outside the Rand monetary area is not going to be subject to tax any longer. It will be taxed somewhere else in the world where you are resident on whatever basis. Most of them are residence based now, but that's where you'll pay tax on those items. To the extent that you pay double tax, either tax here and tax there or the other way around, one of the countries will give you credit. It's generally going to be the country, unless the DTA says so, your country of residence will give you the credit for tax that you pay in South Africa. So coming to the capital gains tax again, we're going to do a capital gains tax calculation. The most important part of what I do for you is going to be your capital gains tax calculation. It's the only things excluded are cash, because there is no capital gains tax on that. Personal use items and properties inside South Africa. Only important to remember, fixed properties in South Africa that are registered in your own name. If you have your primary residence in a trust or a company, that is excluded. You're going to pay CGT on that on the way out. A fixed property in your own name is exempt until you actually sell it. Okay, so that's, I recently had a case where a client was crying. He had a huge portfolio here inside a company in South Africa and had a bigger portfolio in Israel inside a company. Whether it's in a company outside or not, it's taxable. You have huge capital gains tax to pay. And the problem with this is that you have capital gains tax to pay and you don't have the cash flow because you're not actually selling. Okay, so you need to plan for these things. Then with regards to the payment, as I mentioned earlier, your year of assessment ends on the day that you leave, or technically the night before. Capital gains tax is payable, strictly speaking, before you leave. The SARS challenges it. If it gets to court, you're going to be in trouble if your tax was paid after that. It's got to be paid in the year of assessment in which you leave, and technically that's the day you leave. Practically speaking, that's not what happens. Generally, what happens is we get people to include their capital gains and the payment. We give SARS the calculation and the list of assets and liabilities. They always want to see that, and we include the payment in the next provisional payment, or on assessment if it's small. A lot of small people that are not provisional taxpayers don't actually have CGT on the way out. The provisional taxpayers usually have a capital gains tax. They just include it in the next provisional tax return and payment deadline. I haven't had a comeback from that on SARS yet, but I would be very, very careful. It's the only written opinion we can give you on that is to pay it on the day that you leave. And then once you've left South Africa, just some things to remember are that your non-South African residents cannot have South African credit cards. So you need to close credit cards down. You can't have credit cards and overdrafts as a non-resident person. So some people want to leave South Africa and still keep drawing money out through their credit card. You cannot do that. Once you've left South Africa and you've become a non-resident, if you have a company in South Africa that's going to pay you a repayment of a loan, or if you had a loan with a South African company and you move offshore and become a non-resident, your company now has a loan with a non-resident. You need to go and get exchange control approval for that. Money is going to be frozen and held up if you don't do that. You won't be able to pay interest out. Transfer pricing applies to the company. You've got cross-border transactions. If you're drawing a salary out of the South African company, you need to possibly get that approved. There's a lot of things that you need to consider once you've left South Africa, if you have ties and transactions back with entities in South Africa. Finally, your bank accounts need to be marked as non-resident accounts. So under the old system, when you left, you had a blocked account, and all money leaving South Africa had to leave through that blocked account. Under the new system, there are no more blocked accounts, but you do need to have a non-resident account. So South Africans, the most important thing for me there is that South Africans pay tax on interest. Non-residents don't pay tax on interest in South Africa unless they're carrying on business in South Africa, but they are subject to withholding tax on interest. Withholding tax is 15% unless it is reduced by a DTA. But you're not going to get all of that stuff correct if you haven't got the right bank account. So you need to get all these ducks in a row, otherwise you're going to have problems down the line, especially with capital flows out of the country. Right?
Okay, thanks, Michael. We're just going to move on to the next slide now, and it's more of the same of what Michael's just been talking about at the end there. And that is, what are the pitfalls? What are things that one has to consider? And he's already started working on that. And I think it's very important to understand that exchange control, which very few people understand the consequences of not being compliant. You do need to be exchange control compliant and make sure that the Reserve Bank is on board, as well as a receiver of revenue. When you go, just these, and I've just got bullet points, and Michael and I are going to go backwards and forwards on these things. But in terms of inheritance, we often find that parents die, leave in their wills their estate to their children, but their children are not resident here. And the children have not emigrated. To get the funds to them then requires a much longer and drawn-out process than if they had emigrated, where you've got official stamps, tax clearance, etc., and it's much easier for the money to go. So please, please, if you've left parents here and there's wealth that's going to come to you, please emigrate now. It just makes everybody's lives much, much easier. I think it's important to understand that if you haven't emigrated, SARS is still very interested in you, and they still want to tax you on your worldwide income if they possibly can. Michael, you were going to talk about bank accounts. I don't know if you want to say more about inheritance, and I think you've covered the bank account issue.
Yeah, so the bank accounts are, I mean, we spend, Diane, myself, and Diane's team spend quite a lot of time with clients on there's two major things that hold us up. People that have left 30 years ago, their tax numbers have become dormant and inactive, and it's very difficult to get them sorted out. It's difficult for you overseas. You know, I had a client that was paying 500 Rand a phone call. You know, you phone SARS, you can be number 1,000 in a queue. To phone the banks, some of them don't even answer the phone. So to phone from overseas is not practical. So you're going to give us power of attorney to get these things done. There's a whole host of documentation we need, because SARS under the POPI laws makes it not so simple to prove who we are, and it's difficult to get appointments, and it just becomes a nightmare. So reactivating the tax number is one problem. The other problem is bank accounts. If a lot of the time we've got people over here with trusts or with policies, those institutions and organizations are not allowed to make payments to non-South African resident bank accounts. They have to make deposits into South African bank accounts. Now, if you've been outside of South Africa and you want to open a bank account, it's not so easy. Some of the banks want you to fill in an inch of paper and courier the originals across the water. Others will, you know, we do have connections through some of the banks that have agreed to open bank accounts quite quickly on emailed papers rather than courier originals, but it still takes time to get these things opened. So the bank accounts are a problem. It's if someone immigrates properly and does things correctly, and we get the bank accounts converted correctly where there's no pressure, it just works much better. Where there's pressure, and it always happens that way. Somebody dies, and the next day everyone's got no money, and money needs to flow very quickly. That's where these things come out, and they become very painful. Okay, so that's the bank account stuff.
Thank you. So then on trusts, and some of you who are listening may be beneficiaries of trusts, and you may be getting a distribution from a trust. It is much more difficult, if not virtually impossible, to get a distribution from a trust to a non-resident. It's all very case specific again. Is a settler alive? Is a settler not alive? But it does require approvals and tax clearance. So please be well aware, if you have left or are going and you are the beneficiary of a trust, the trust really needs to, and the trustees need to look at your position and what effect it's going to have on the trust. And the most complicated places, which are the places or the ones we understand best, which is where lots of South Africans go, are Australia, the United States, and the UK. Europe has its own set of issues. We obviously have lots of non-resident South African folk now who are living in those jurisdictions, who are beneficiaries of trusts. We understand how that works. And it's very important for you to understand how it works too, and how to receive distributions in those other jurisdictions and what the tax implications are. If you haven't emigrated, you won't get any money, basically.
Yeah.
And that's assuming you were SA tax resident, really. So again, very case specific, but please be aware there are challenges there. And it's much better to know about the challenges up front than when you're in a hurry now, because suddenly you need to buy a house or whatever, and the funds are sitting in a trust, and you need, the oft purchase says you got to put the deposit down, you need the money. It's not going to happen overnight if the funds are sitting in a trust. So we just need to make you aware of that. Michael, do you want to add anything else there?
So just on the trust, so they just in our experience, and we've done hundreds of these things now. So we've been working with that for a good couple of years now. Before that, we did SVDPs together from the 2017 year, 2016 and 2017 years.
Won't you just explain, Michael? Sorry, just say just explain what a VDP is.
So VDP is a voluntary, it's short for voluntary disclosure program. So SARS and SARB have these programs. SARS has a formal program. So I've got a case now where under a previous amnesty, the applicant was required to put all the income from a trust into her own tax return from that time onwards. That hasn't happened. SARS hasn't found the lady yet, but you can go forward voluntarily through the VDP unit under a specific process, and you can now go and disclose SARS. So it's the principle of come to us before we find you. So if you go under the VDP, the principle is that you generally pay the tax and interest. You don't pay penalties, and there's no criminal charges. There is a penalty table which is applicable in certain circumstances. I've only ever had one penalty, which was quite small. Most of the time it's tax and interest. That's SARS, and a lot of the time, well, not a lot of the time, but we have had quite a few immigration applications where you're going to get looked at quite closely on the way out. So before we do that, we ask you, is there any unpaid tax? Is there anything in the woodwork that needs to be fixed up? Because that's your last opportunity to fix it. If SARS finds you, they will throw the book at you. And the penalties are big now. The penalties are big. 150% is there, and it gets meted out often. Then the Reserve Bank doesn't quite have as formal a process, but there is a principle where you can approach the Reserve Bank, and you will get a penalty. The penalty is generally half of the penalty that they'll throw at you if they find you. And Reserve Bank transgressions come with criminal charges and freezing of assets. So it's always better to go forward rather than be found later. But what I wanted to say is in all of the work that we've done over the years, trusts has always been the most complex and most troublesome area. Someone's immigrating or someone's immigrated or fixing up an immigration, and they desperately need money out of a trust, and it then comes out of the woodwork that the trust has never had financials or its tax is not compliant, and those days are rapidly coming to an end as well, because at the moment you've got to fix it. And as we know, next year there's a focus on trusts. Trusts are going to be looked at quite closely next year. They're already drawing them into the third-party data information reporting system. So if you're running a trust without having annual meetings and board minutes and stuff like that, those days are gone. You're going to get sorted out now by SARS.
Okay, thanks, Michael. On dual citizenship, I just put it in there because I know that people want to keep their dual citizenship. In South Africa, you can, but that's not really our area of expertise.
I do have something to say there.
Sorry?
I do have something to say there on the dual citizenship. Just to mention so that you're aware of it. So Da's right. We don't get involved in the home affairs side of things. You don't have to, in my view, apply to anyone to leave South Africa. We don't live in a communist country. If you want to leave, you get on a plane and go. But you do need to fix your affairs, as we keep saying. If you're a South African citizen, the way that this thing works now is if you're going to hold, when you immigrate from South Africa, you don't give up your citizenship. You still have a South African passport and a South African ID. If you go to a place like Mauritius, the South African passport is the only passport you're ever going to have. Cannot get a Mauritian passport unless you're in Mauritius. So you need to keep your South African passport and documents current. Before you accept dual citizenship or citizenship of another country, you need to apply to Home Affairs for permission. Before you get this foreign citizenship, you need to apply to hold dual citizenship. If you don't, you're automatically going to give up your South African citizenship. And you might not want to do that. It baffles me. People can't wait to leave South Africa. And they do leave South Africa. Then the first thing they do is get up and read News 24 every day. And they don't want to give up their citizenship. So that's fine. But if you don't, make sure you apply for permission, because otherwise you're going to automatically give it up. And the last thing is with regards to your South African passport. It's a Reserve Bank requirement that you enter and leave South Africa on your South African passport if you have one. So if you've left South Africa and you've been gone for 10 years and you have an Australian passport, if you still have a South African passport, when you land in this country, you need to enter on that passport. And when you leave, you need to leave on that passport. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So, and there's more and more and more. And I would think this webinar might have raised more questions than given answers, but was just very important to point out that this process is one that one does need to follow, or you at least need to think of following. But it's all part of a bigger picture. So we've nearly finished, you'll be pleased to hear. And just to tell you where we're coming from, we are a family office. Those basically are the 4 silos that all your assets and your life basically falls into. Some of you will be involved in some of them, some will be involved in others, but you probably all in at least one of those. And estates is the one basically where immigration falls, but it affects everything else, including your life, retirement, and pension benefits. Please note, immigration has specific rules on those particular products, which we can enlighten you to. So we're just giving you the big picture here. Your immigration may affect far more than you think it does. It's probably not affecting only you. It may be affecting quite a lot of other things. So please come to us if you need help on any of those areas. Each one is quite specialized, but we do understand the big picture when you're undertaking immigration. And then one thing to point out, because so many of you go to the UK, Anchor RCI, Anchor, we're a subsidiary, as Kate mentioned, have an office in the UK, and that does specialize in this kind of work, wealth management, And it's somewhere where you can go on the other side, because remember, you're going somewhere else. And you need to take that into consideration as well. And just to point out that there is a team in the UK that we can refer you to. We do have contacts. We don't have offices in all the other jurisdictions we've mentioned, where we can provide you with information. And when I say this, what I mean is we know enough to know when we don't know enough. And one can't be an expert in everything. So if you're going to the US, we have people there that you can consult, etc., etc. And that brings us to the end. Michael, thank you very much. Is there anything else you would like to add before I sign off?
Just fix your affairs. You can't leave things hanging. It doesn't go well. It won't go well for you.
Yeah, and I think this is pointed out, that please be organized. If you are on your way, if you need help, we're here to help you. And any queries you've got the contact details there. But please don't just go and not have considered all of this. It's going to complicate all your lives in the future, and your families. So there we've got me, I'm there, and we've got Kate. We will then, if you let us have your queries or questions or whatever help you need, and we will then pass it on to Michael, or if there's somebody else that you need as part of this kind of process, we'll do the same. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We do appreciate the time you've given us, and we look forward to hearing from you if you need us, and enjoy the rest of the Friday. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Michael.
Goodbye.